11:42 p.m., December 16, 1944. The Ardennes forest, Belgium. The air was a razor, slicing through wool and skin alike. Inside the stone walls of the Villa de Gries, Oberleutnant Hans Kessler of the 2nd Panzer Division poured a final splash of looted schnapps. He felt untouchable. He had 40 battle-hardened men, 2 MG-42 machine guns covering the only approach, and 3 feet of ancient masonry shielding his head. To Kessler, the Americans were a broken force, shivering in the tree line, waiting for the inevitable end. In the next 90 seconds, Kessler would be a prisoner of war. Below the frozen floorboards, in a crawlspace slick with the overflow of a ruptured sewer pipe, crouched Private Silas Vance. He wasn't clutching a grenade. He didn't have his finger on a trigger. Instead, he gripped a rusted tuning wrench and a length of high-tension steel wire he'd stripped from a shattered upright piano in the foyer. His breath came in shallow, freezing puffs. What Vance was about to do was not just unorthodox, it was explicitly forbidden by the High Command. To the West Point strategists, Silas was a liability, a soldier who refused to respect the geometry of fire or the sanctity of the field manual. But on this night, Vance would prove that civilian logic could dismantle a fortress where artillery had failed. The thesis of tonight's story is simple. Silas Vance didn't fight the enemy, he tuned the battlefield until it collapsed. Silas Vance didn't come from a line of warriors or marksmen. He came from the humid, sawdust-heavy air of a workshop in Appalachian, Virginia. Before the draft, Silas was a third-generation piano tuner and luthier. While other recruits had spent their youth hunting deer or working assembly lines, Silas spent his thinking in frequencies. He understood tension. He knew that a single steel wire under 200 pounds of pressure held the potential for either a perfect middle C or a lethal bone-snapping whip. He understood how sound traveled through hardwood, how a vibration at one end of a structural beam could be felt rather than heard at the other. When he enlisted, his instructors at Fort Benning were utterly baffled. He failed his marksmanship qualification twice, not because he couldn't shoot, but because he kept adjusting the iron sights with scraps of soda cans to account for the way the wind hummed through the grass. They saw a distracted hillbilly who couldn't follow a reconnaissance report. They completely missed the man who viewed the entire world as a mathematical instrument waiting to be tuned. The objective was point 404, the villa. It sat atop a ridge like a crown of thorns, its machine gun nests turning the snow-covered slope into a meat grinder. Standard Army doctrine dictated a frontal assault with heavy smoke cover. It was a butcher's plan. Corporal David Miller, 21, from Sandusky, Ohio. He had a 6-year-old daughter back home who would keep his last letter, a promise to take her to the county fair, tucked inside her pillowcase for the next 60 years. He died 10 yards from the tree line. Private First Class Anthony Russo, 19, a baker's son from South Philadelphia. He was hit by a sniper's round before he even unclipped his canteen. Sergeant Leo Gorski, 24, from the Detroit rail yards. He was a week away from a rotation home. He was cut in half trying to suppress the MG-42 with a light machine gun. Captain Sterling, a man with polished jump boots and a soul made of rigid military regulations, refused to pivot. The manual says we take the high ground with overwhelming fire, Sterling barked at the exhausted survivors. When Silas suggested using the structural resonance of the building to flush them out, Sterling threatened him with a court-martial. We are here to fight a war, Vance, not perform a concerto. Get back in the hole. Silas Vance waited for the absolute cover of a moonless midnight. He had observed a flaw the West Point strategists had missed from their maps. The villa wasn't just a house, it was a sounding board. A massive cast-iron broken piano sat in the ballroom directly above the German barracks, its legs shattered by a previous mortar hit. Silas realized that the main support beam of the villa was cracked, held in place only by the tension of the piano's heavy frame and the interlocking floor joists. If he could manipulate that tension, he wouldn't need a single bullet to bring the ceiling down on Kessler's head. He presented his plan to Sterling one last time. He he was met with the threat of unauthorized field modifications. Silas didn't argue. He simply disappeared into the darkness, crawling through the mud toward the villa's basement with nothing but his wrench, his wire, and a silent prayer. He was going rogue, operating in a tactical vacuum with zero support and the weight of a potential prison sentence on his shoulders. Inside the crawl space, the smell of fermented apples and wet coal was suffocating. Silas worked with his fingers, feeling for the iron pins of the piano's wreckage through the rotted lath and plaster of the ceiling. The technical precision was agonizing. He had to apply exactly 180 pounds of torque to the primary tension wire while anchoring a secondary line at a 15-degree downward angle to the villa's load-bearing strut. One slip, and the snap of the wire would alert every German in the building. The sweat soaked through his wool uniform despite the sub-zero air. He checked his watch. 480 yards from the American lines. 14 inches of clearance. Zero margin for error. Silas found the sweet spot, the point where the structural integrity of the room above met the acoustic resonance of the piano frame. He exhaled halfway, held, squeezed the wrench. The tension broke. A sound like a thunderclap ripped through the house. Not an explosion, but the high-velocity snap of steel and the groan of shifting stone. The floor of the ballroom buckled. The broken piano, weighing nearly half a ton, crashed through the weakened joists directly onto the sleeping Germans. Dust blinded the enemy. Panic took them. They didn't hear a command. They heard the house itself screaming. Thinking they were under a massive heavy artillery strike, the disoriented platoon stumbled out of the wreckage, hands raised into the waiting arms of the Americans, stunned. The broken piano ambush resulted in 42 German prisoners, including Oberleutnant Kessler, and the capture of a vital crossroads that paved the way for the relief of Bastogne. 0 American lives were lost that night. In the official after-action reports, Captain Sturman credited the victory to structural fatigue of the enemy-held position caused by previous shelling. The Army eventually studied acoustic disruption and added it to official doctrine, but the name Silas Vance was nowhere to be found in the credits. He was a private. He was a tuner. He was an anomaly. After the war, Silas didn't use the GI Bill to go to college or seek a commission. He returned to the blue-collar silence of the Virginia mountains. He spent the next 40 years in a quiet shop, restoring instruments and tuning the uprights in local churches. He never told his neighbors about .404. To him, the war was just a job that required a very specific set of tools and a keen ear for when things were about to snap. He had pianos to tune. If you found this story compelling, please like this video, subscribe to stay connected with these untold histories.